Chapter 2, Nogales. I looked at my watch. It was 5:53 a.m. I had driven straight from Los Angeles to Nogales, stopping only twice to refuel and to grab a bite to eat. Carlos had asked me to meet him at 9 o'clock in front of the Greyhound bus depot, but I had given myself plenty of leeway in case the traffic was heavy or I had car trouble. As I parked the car in an all-night parking lot near the bus depot, I wondered if I had made the right decision in coming. Carlos had sounded strange during the brief telephone conversation. It was as if he couldn't talk or was reluctant to do so. I could have easily misunderstood the time and place of our meeting. There had been a great deal of static on the line, with a Spanish-speaking female voice interrupting. I had assumed it was the operator, but now I wasn't certain. Despite the feeling of having met him before, I didn't really know Carlos and I wasn't familiar with Mexico, for I had never ventured beyond the vicinity of Clara's house. Rural Mexico was, to me, a hostile and rugged country where anything could happen to the unsuspecting traveler. Also, I had been exaggerating when I told Carlos that I spoke Spanish. The few classes I had taken at the university hadn't given me a command of the language. Once again, it seemed, I had jumped into a situation I was completely ill-equipped to handle. The long drive had left me exhausted. I set the alarm of my wristwatch for 8:30, then stretched out along the back seat to relax. With my eyes closed, I practiced some recapitulating breathing, a practice I had neglected to keep up. I wondered if, by returning to Mexico, I would be able to better understand some of the inconceivable events that had taken place under the guidance of Clara and her group of sorcerers. Those events now seemed so distant that trying to recall them filled me with a deep melancholy. My constant concern with myself and my daily activities had clouded my vision, and in spite of the months of recapitulating and the countless promises I had made to change, old ways and feelings had slowly crept back like crabgrass, whose growth had been trimmed, but whose roots remained stubbornly intact. Then sun beat down on my head when I awoke from a sound sleep. I had been dreaming I was gazing at leaves of the grove of trees in front of Clara's house. I experienced instant panic. It was 9:30. The alarm had failed to go off, or if it did, I had not heard it. I feared I would miss my appointment with Destiny, and the long drive would have been for nothing. As usual, I had been careless, when I should have remained alert. On top of everything, the sun, shining through the car window, had given me a king-sized headache. In my hasty departure, I neglected to bring a hat. I locked the car door and headed for the bus depot where I joined the crowd of people milling about in a great hurry. Everyone was either going towards the border or had just crossed over and was rushing away from it. I nearly collided with a hunchbacked woman. When I heard crying, I realized that the woman wasn't hunchbacked at all. She was carrying a baby wrapped in a rebozo tied to her back and shoulders. Not even the baby's head was visible, and I wondered how it could breathe. I felt so sorry for the woman that I gave her a $10 bill. She took it and smiled gratefully, flashing a silver front tooth. At the sight of money, I was instantly surrounded by a group of boys selling lottery tickets. They all insisted that I buy one or at least let them carry my bag. I bought a box of chiclets from a girl in pigtails and hurried past stands selling belts, ponchos, and pottery figurines. I wanted to buy some bananas, for the last meal I had eaten was a meatloaf sandwich at Gila Bend, but I didn't dare take the time. I needed to get to the Greyhound bus depot in a hurry. Cars were parked or stopped in every available space and everyone seemed to be honking at the same time. I stood on the street corner waiting for an opening to cross, when I saw Carlos in the distance, waving his hand. I couldn't tell if he was telling me to stay put or to meet him. I was so relieved to see him that I hurried across the street, stopping a few cars in the process. At close range, Carlos looked different. His clothes smelled of mesquite wood smoke. At the university he wore tailored slacks and sports coats. Now he had on Levis, a long-sleeved khaki shirt and hiking boots. He had a kind of energy and agility that made him stand out from the crowd. Something in the way he balanced his weight on the balls of his feet, gave the impression of an athlete with superb control over his movement. "I suppose you thought I wasn't going to show up," I said to break the awkwardness. "You're right. I was beginning to wonder if you were coming. How was the drive?" I was in a daze through most of it. Luckily, there wasn't much traffic. I would have been on time, but I fell asleep. "My God. Did you have an accident?" "No, I woke up in the nick of time, but that's the reason I'm late." He gave me a confused look. I realized that he had thought I had fallen asleep at the wheel while driving rather than in the back seat. "To be perfectly frank," I said quickly, "I didn't expect to hear from you." "Me too," Carlos said, taking my bag. "I was surprised when I was told to call you." "Who told you to call me?" "The Yaqui Indian I am working with." Carlos explained that, true to his promise, he had mentioned to his informant that he had met a student at the university and that he had invited her to come to Mexico. "My informant wanted me to tell him in detail the circumstances of our meeting," Carlos continued. "What did you tell him?" "I described to him how Rex Jones got fed up with your questioning and handed you over to me. Apparently, that was an omen." "What do you mean by an omen?" "Don Juan said that things never come to us directly, that there always has to be an usher who opens the door, and that if we didn't jump at that precise instant, the door would close and we would never know what might have been." Carlos looked at me seriously. "You mean Rex Jones is some sort of an usher?" I asked, confused. He nodded. "According to Don Juan, mysterious forces were at work. Something in me had voiced an invitation to bring you to Mexico, and something in you jumped to accept it. That could only mean one thing." "What was that?" I wondered if it wasn't the one thing that is on every man's mind where an overnight trip with a woman is concerned. Carlos took my arm to help me around an open manhole in the sidewalk. "It means," he explained, "that at one level, we were both aware of the importance of the moment. It also means that power had opened the way, and that we have to be impeccable in order to travel under its auspices. In other words, we are in the hands of power moving through an open door." A cold shiver ran up my back. I was afraid I was not prepared for such a journey. "From now on, neither you nor I are in charge of what will happen," Carlos continued. "Whatever may happen after we cross the border falls within the designs of power. In other words, something besides you or me will be calling the shots." He gave me a penetrating look. "Are you up to it?" Before I could reply, we found ourselves at the border checkpoint. Carlos told me that he had left his car on the other side, and that he would cross over and wait for me in Mexico. He showed me which form I needed to fill out and which door I would be passing through to enter Mexico. He handed me my bag, then left through that same doorway and disappeared around the corner of the building. I didn't like being left alone. I envisioned it as a test to see if I could make it across on my own. Or perhaps, Carlos thought I spoke enough Spanish that I didn't need him to translate. While I waited in line, I began assessing my situation. I was about to embark on a journey with someone I had seen in a vision, on a quest for power in a manner that could only be called following the designs of the spirit. Carlos had made it clear from the outset that we would not be on a vacation, but under the auspices of power. I didn't know what power meant, but I knew that it was too abstract a concept for precise definitions. On such a journey, all one could do was to acquiesce and follow its elusive course. As I mulled things over, I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. Perhaps Nelita or Mr. Abelar were among the Mexicans that had lined up to cross the border. It had been many months since I had seen them, but I was certain I would recognize them, especially Emilito, who often visited me in dreams. He had big owl-like eyes that blinked as he stared vacantly. I would wake up in the middle of the night and find him standing by my bedside. Then he would vanish before I could talk to him. I heard raspy coughing behind me. I turned around, just in time to see an old man drop a huge glob of saliva onto the floor. I cringed, nauseated. I would have moved away, but in front of me was a woman holding an infant whose runny nose was making tracks on his face. He was trying to grab my hair with his sticky fists. I recognized the tattered magenta rebozo. It was the same woman I had bumped into as I had hurried to the Greyhound bus depot. She smiled at me in recognition and said something in rapid Spanish which I didn't understand. I smiled back, dumbly nodding. It was hot and stuffy and I felt dizzy, but I didn't dare to go to the door for fear of losing my place in line. I reached inside my purse for a scented handkerchief and waved it in front of my face with a devil-may-care attitude. Rather than leaving me room, the man behind me crowded forward as the line progressed. I felt another wave of nausea flood me and became totally judgmental. I rationalized my feelings of superiority as an attempt to balance my physical distress. I realized that these were dangerous feelings to have. During the long hours of recounting my life, I had discovered that I had been surrounded by people who felt intrinsically superior to everyone else. Their superiority was based on nothing but false reasoning, just as was mine. I had simply copied their feelings to perfection. I kept telling myself that I was not a part of the scene, but was a student of anthropology, a person of cultured European ancestry, who was there to do research, not be touched by the poverty and filth that pervaded the place. In the midst of my emotional buttressing, I experienced a profound feeling of dejection as I realized that months of recapitulating meant nothing when confronted with discomfort and a lack of control wherein my idea of the myself was threatened. What was worse, I saw now, was that the power to imbue the self with worth comes from an unshakable core that we all have, the feeling, or rather the certainty, that we are special and above reproach. I moved forward to put distance between myself and the old man behind me, of whom I kept catching glimpses from the corner of my eye. He seemed to be inwardly laughing at my discomfort, and that made me even more annoyed. For distraction, I opened my purse and took out the gold pen Clara had loaned me to make my recapitulation list, a list of names of all the people I had ever encountered during my lifetime. It had been a long list and I had come to consider the pen as my own possession. Clara had said it had belonged to one of the members of the Nogales party, although she had never said who that person was. When I returned to Los Angeles, I took the pen with me and used it to take my examinations at the university. If I did not have my power pen with me, I always felt I did poorer on the exams. I filled out the tourist card, but before I could return the pen to my purse, the old man behind me butted up against me and asked, "May I borrow your pen?" Startled to hear English spoken, I turned around to face him. He was old, but not decrepit, of medium height, with a wide flat nose and oriental-looking eyes. He had an air of familiarity about him as he smiled in a friendly manner. I looked at his hands, they were dirty. I did not want to lend my power pen to a stranger who might contaminate it with weird energy, or worse yet, pocket it while I wasn't looking. I wanted to say I didn't have a pen, but he had obviously seen me using it. Besides, outright lying was something I had trouble doing. The recapitulation had helped me realize that my reluctance to lie stemmed from several painful childhood incidents. On one occasion, my mother had accused me of tracking mud onto her newly polished linoleum floor. I had had no trouble lying then, and I had accused my younger brother of dirtying up the floor. But when my mother found my muddy shoes under my bed, she made me apologize to my brother and to beg his forgiveness. I also had to go to bed without supper. Later, as I recapitulated this event, I realized that it had not been so much the dirty kitchen floor that had infuriated my mother, but the act of lying, which was something well-brought-up girls simply ought not to do. I looked at the old man. As if sensing my preoccupation, he wiped his hands on the front of his shirt to clean them. "It's a beautiful pen," he whispered, leaning closer. "I will guard it carefully. Too many thieves around." I couldn't tell if he was being facetious, but as if in a daze, I slowly handed him the pen. From the corner of my eye, I kept a close watch to make sure he didn't pocket it. I sneaked a few sideways glances at his face too. It was quite striking, now that I got a better look. He had high cheekbones, strong Indian features, and eyes that burned with a fierce bird of prey intensity that reminded me of Emilito's. It gave the man an awesome, yet strangely appealing quality. Watching his face made me dizzy. I heard a loud buzzing in my ear and felt a pressure at my solar plexus. The room began to sway and I felt as if I was about to keel over. "Lean on me," the man said as he pressed my back to steady me. "When is the baby due?" the woman in front of me asked, turning around. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. I realized, then, that they must have thought I was pregnant and that was why I was feeling faint. "I know how you must feel, dear," said the woman, giving me a sympathetic pat. She looked like Clara, only shorter, stockier, and darker complected. "When I was carrying Haim," she continued, "I used to feel faint all the time." "I'm fine," I said. "I just haven't eaten." "I saw you in the street with that young man," she continued as if she hadn't heard me. "Is he your husband, or did you cross the border to get married?" "I did not come to Mexico to get married," I yelled, "and I'm not pregnant." Everyone in the room turned to look at who was shouting. A young man leaning against the wall smiled and shook his head as if he knew better. "Perhaps you came for an abortion," the old man said with a snicker. "Shame on you." He grinned, making his eyes look wild. I was so embarrassed that I had a hard time taking in enough air. I stared at the old man's face. His eyes were shining as if illuminated by two tiny flames. They were black, glossy, like an animal's except for two tiny dots of amber light that kept getting larger and larger. Yet try as I might, I could not turn my head away. I became mesmerized by his eyes. The room became a white haze except for the man's face, which had a golden ring around it. Then his face started to expand until his features disappeared altogether. All that was left was a ball of light. I was no longer in the room, but seemed to be moving at infinite speed through a long black tunnel. "Make room," I heard someone call. "Give the gringa some air." I opened my eyes to see muddy shoes and khaki trousers. I was gazing up at a handful of strangers who were looking down at me. I realized then, I was lying on the floor of the border checkpoint. The thought of being on that dirty floor full of spit and filth made me immediately raise up. Someone helped me to stand by pulling my arms. Another person handed me water in a paper cup. Gratefully, I drank it, not thinking whether it was drinkable or not. I remembered my pen. I looked for the old man with the burning eyes, but to my dismay, he was nowhere in sight. A younger man solicitously handed me half of a cheese sandwich wrapped in cellophane. I took it numbly. All I wanted was to get out of that room into the fresh air. When the official stamped my form, I hurried out the side door, stepping into air, light and mariachi music coming from a nearby restaurant. Across the street I saw Carlos talking to some men sitting on large cement sacks that had been stacked up against the side of a building. When I approached, he did not introduce me, but hurriedly broke off the conversation. "No problems crossing?" he asked. "It was so stuffy in that room that I keeled over and hit the floor," I said dryly. Then someone swiped my gold pen, and everyone accused me of being pregnant, but other than that, it all went fine. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He looked at me concerned. I imagined my pallor was as gray as the powdered cement scattered over ground. "When was the last time you've eaten?" I had a fleeting image of Clara's well-lit kitchen and the wonderful meals we would have there prepared by the elusive caretaker, Emilito. "A lifetime ago," I said, knowing that I was indulging in melancholy and self-pity. I allowed the waves of dejection to pass until I felt at ease again. Carlos said something in Spanish to the people he had been talking to, and they all looked at me and shook their heads pathetically. "Carlitos certainly has his hands full," one of them said in heavily accented English, and everyone giggled and nodded in agreement. Then I saw a man walk past us at a brisk pace. He seemed to be in a great hurry, but he paused and turned for an instant as if he wanted me to see his face. "That's him," I said, grabbing Carlos's sleeve. He's the one who took my pen. Who? Before I could point the man out, he disappeared in the crowd of Mexicans gathered in the street.